Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Bangalore International Center and to the session, Russia Up Close and Personal. The session has been thematically divided into two segments. In the first segment, we have Sumaa, who will lead us through the journey, her rail journey in the Trans-Siberian Railway. She will then further elaborate on the specific Siberian experiences up close and personal with special reference to the Lake Baikal. And then she goes on to speak about her Russian encounters with people and with the very essence of Russia. I will join her in the second segment to tell a tale of two cities, St Petersburg and Moscow, through the lens, enduring legacies through the lens of art and culture. Ladies and gentlemen, before I invite Sumaa on stage, I would request you to please keep your mobiles on silent. And a caveat, I think Sumaa and me are attempting the impossible: Trans-Siberian, Lake Baikal, St Petersburg, Moscow, music, art, literature, and in conversation. We hope it pans out well. Thank you.
Thank you, Sadhana. Very good evening to all of you who've taken the time out on this weeknight, Tuesday, to come here and listen to insights from Russia. So in the next 25 to 30 minutes or so, I will be covering insights about the Trans-Siberian Railway, my journey across Russia. And I'll be doing a deep focus on Siberia, especially Lake Baikal, because that was one of the places where I felt deeply connected with Russia and something that also felt like home to me. I'll touch briefly upon food and culture. Like Sadhana said, Russia is so big, so we're going to really do our best today to cover as much as we can and give you some insights. I'll be talking about a few interesting people that I met along the way. And this connects with some of the myths that we carry about Russia and also about the Russian people as being quite brusque and standoffish. So through my experiences here, we'll see if that actually works or not. So, thank you. Okay, just to set the context, I spent 1 month in Russia in last May, from 16th May to the 12th of June. The total trip was 29 days. I covered 15 places. I took 11 train rides. I stayed in 11 hotel rooms. Many of those train rides were also overnight journeys. And I covered 4 time zones of the total 11 time zones that span the large country that is Russia. So this is the first glimpse of the train that I got on the very first morning that I was to take this train journey. So this is the map of the Trans-Siberian Railway. Now there are actually 3 routes that run across the Trans-Siberian. So this here, the red one, is the pure Trans-Siberian, which runs only in Russia. Then there is the Trans-Manchurian, which breaks off at Ulan-Ude and it goes down. Sorry, this is the Trans-Mongolian, the orange line, which breaks off at Ulan-Ude and it goes into Ulaanbaatar, down all the way into China, ending at Beijing. Then there's the Manchurian, which breaks off from here, the blue line, and it goes into China through the western side into Beijing, ending at Beijing. So these are the 3 routes, and they're all in general called the Trans-Siberian, but the Trans-Siberian is only the red line, which runs purely in Russia. One of the things that I found really interesting about taking this journey is that most of their signboards has a kilometer, and this refers to the distance from Moscow. And also the time zones within Russia. And I found this quite difficult when booking tickets because they don't give the arrival and departure time as per the local time. They give it as per the Moscow time. So everywhere you're running calculations of where you are in Russia and how many hours after Moscow that is. So these are very, very good indicators for how far from Moscow you really are. Some beautiful scenes here on the track. Everywhere you see a lot of Russian pause and this Russian culture. Even the ticket inspectors are quite well dressed and very, very smartly turned out. This is the Platzkartny inside the Trans-Siberian. It is the third class, and it's called Platzkartny, which loosely translates to open plan. So just like our Indian trains here, they have two berths on the side with the top and bottom, and on the left they have four. Unlike ours, which has three on each side, this has two on each side. This is the second class, which is a coupe. So you have some privacy here, where in the Platzkartny, there's absolutely no privacy. So everything's open, and privacy is what you make of it. So everyone continues living their life and going about doing their thing with the perception of privacy. Here you have 4 beds in one coupe, so you get to shut the door and you have complete privacy. And you have better quality bedding, so that's one differentiation. They're softer and more comfortable. And this is also the corridor, so you can see all the doors and the different coupes here on the right. And if you feel like looking out, you can come out and stand here and enjoy the passing views, which are phenomenal throughout that journey. It's quite, the scenery just keeps changing, and every scenery is just worth a picture. This is something which is quintessentially Russian and quintessentially Trans-Siberian. So this is a typical highball glass, which is inserted into this metal holder with a lot of carving on it, and the Cyrillic lettering on that is RZD, which is the short form for the Russian railway. Now this has deep roots in Russian art because the Russian elite classes actually collected these glass holders, and it was a collector's item, and they converted this piece of Russian culture into everyday life in the train by serving tea in these glasses with the metal holder. And you can just borrow these from, each wagon has an attendant, so you can just go walk up to the attendant and borrow these and have your tea in that. And mashed potatoes, one of the favorites within the train journey, because on the train, although you do have a pantry, it's not very popular. And I still don't know the reason. It's just, people just don't go and dine in the car that much. So it's more of a culture to carry your own food in the train, and you can imagine all kinds of meat smells are unleashed in the wagon when everything is shut and it's all within the AC environment. But one of the quick instant foods that people like to rely on are these mashed potatoes, which come in a powder form in a packet, like our cup noodles. And you just pour hot water, and you can have it with bread, or you can just eat it as is. It's mixed with cheese, and it's quite delicious. This is the samovar. The samovar is again a quintessentially Russian piece of art, which is the hot water boiler. So it is the water dispenser where water is kept at an optimum of 100 degrees boiling point. Now this doesn't look anything like those ornately decorated typical samovars that you get in Russia. This is a very functional industrial hot water boiler, which is required for the long train journeys. But this is very, very important for every wagon, because everyone relies on this for their tea, coffee, and everything, and all their instant foods to make them edible. That was was about the Trans-Siberian. Now we'll step into Siberia itself. So I'm going to focus more on the eastern part of Russia. So I started my journey in Irkutsk, which is considered to be the capital of Siberia, and it's the biggest city in the east in Russia. And that is river Angara. And the city itself was very clean. It's quite like every other Western European or even Eastern European city that we see, very neatly laid out roads and very well defined human and vehicular traffic. Every city, has a Lenin Street. Even the villages has a Lenin Street there, and you have beautiful sculptures like those dotting the promenades and the avenues along Russia. Now, Irkutsk is an entry point to get into Lake Baikal. It's 60 kilometers from Lake Baikal. So that's where I started my journey into Lake Baikal, where I spent a lot of time around the lake to truly understand the biodiversity and to understand the cultural significance of this lake in Russia. It is the oldest freshwater lake, and it is 20 to 25 million years old. And just to give you some context, the Grand Canyon is supposed to be 6 to 7 million years old. So in comparison, the Grand Canyon is quite young, and Lake Baikal is actually very, very old. So it has very deep roots in that environment and geography. Some of the statistics here that I want to highlight is that it's 48 kilometers wide, and its shoreline is 2,100 kilometers. And it has about 330 rivers and streams flowing into it. So it is truly one of the most magnificent water bodies that I've ever seen, because it's a freshwater lake, but it has the magnanimity of an ocean, but without the raging waves of the ocean, or without that sound and the liveliness of the ocean, which sometimes makes it a little difficult to get your head around, because it feels like there's a storm beneath that calm. And yeah, that's something I'll come to a little later. It has 1,800 animal species. Lake Baikal supports 50 different types of species of fish. But the one that interested me the most was omul fish, which you get only in Lake Baikal. And the interesting part about omul fish is that it's naturally salted. It's a freshwater lake, but you have this interesting mix of biodiversity which has sea life in it, and you have this very special omul fish which is naturally salted. And of course the Baikal seal is a huge specialty in that region, which you find only around the lake. Over the next few minutes, I want to talk a little bit about Lake Baikal's other specialties. One is shamanism. Tidal winds is the second. I spoke about the calm and the storm beneath that calm. And then winter ice sports. So this was one of the first images that I clicked of Lake Baikal. This is a sunset image from a small town called Listvyanka, which is the closest entry point to see Lake Baikal from Irkutsk. So it's an hour's drive from Irkutsk, and you get to touch and feel and see Lake Baikal from there. So that was my first introduction to Lake Baikal. I spoke about winter sports. Now, in the winter months, which runs well into March and sometimes April for them. I went there in May, and it was snowing on most days, even in May. And people were like, oh, summer's coming. And for me, I was just freezing. So when in the peak of winter, all of this lake, pretty much all of it, gets completely frozen out. And when that happens, they drive 4-wheel drives on the lake, and that becomes a mode of transportation to get to different places around the lake because it's easier that way. And of course there are a few cruise ships also which run in the summer months, but they're not as popular as being able to drive on the ice in the winter months, which is quite the specialty of this region. This is another view of the lake. To get this shot, I had to climb a mountain, get off the mountain, and then be able to get a shot of the lake from here. This is another one. It looks very calm and placid, but I spoke about the tidal winds. They're really, really a big deal around Lake Baikal, because there are some seasonal winds which have created havoc through history for the villages that have inhabited around the lake. The one that is most feared is called Sarma, S-A-R-M-A. So the wind rises up through the gorges and it kind of sweeps up the water, and it sweeps up everything that comes in its way. Even the villages. So entire villages have known to have just disappeared through those raging winds. So this is actually just one face of Lake Baikal. It has many emotions to it. This picture was taken at Olkhon Island. It's one of the islands on the lake. It is the biggest island on the lake. And this island has 5 villages on it. This is from Khujir village, which is the biggest village on that island. And this rock is called Chamanka rock, or the Burkhan rock. And it has deep implications for the spiritual life of Siberian culture around that region. So Siberian shamanism, as it's called, is one of the most potent and powerful forms of connection with nature. So it's a form of animism where the people connect deeply with natural elements, water, wind, fire, the earth. They worship what is around them and give them the status of being sacred. So this Shamanka rock has many myths revolving around it, and one such is that the head of 13 very powerful monks in Siberian shamanism, which is also called yellow shamanism, are known to reside in a cave in this rock. So it is like our Tirupati, like people go there to worship this rock, and they offer money, they offer whatever they can, and they come back. So, and for me, what was most interesting is that there are no barricades, there's nothing. It's your very personal attachment to that rock. So you have a belief, so you go there, you can touch the rock, you can connect with it in any which way that you feel comfortable. The other thing that I noticed, which has implications for the spiritual life in Russia, are these mini wooden sculptures that have come up on biking and hiking trails around Lake Baikal. Some of them are, here you can see a crocodile, and here you can see a mythical creature. You also have sculptures of dinosaurs, or even monkeys, wolves, all kinds of animals. And the hikers and the bikers along that trail, they feed grass to these animals and to these sculptures, and they consider them to be their gods. Just like in Hinduism, you consider an idol to be the god. This is their god, and they actually worship these sculptures. Now I'm going to take you through the Circum-Baikal Railway, which helped me experience another part of Lake Baikal, another aspect of the lake. The Circum-Baikal Railway is a steam engine train journey that takes you through the southern tip of the lake, starting right there at Sludyanka. So it takes you around that tip all the way to Port Baikal. So this entire stretch takes 89 kilometers and the train covers it in 5 hours. So it goes extremely slow, very, very slow. And it stops at various villages along this route. One of the important things about this is that it's an engineering marvel. And tourists now take that train only to experience the sheer magnanimity of what they did with engineering. So it covers 400 bridges and viaducts and it goes through 40 tunnels. So in those 5 hours you experience the lake through a very intimate way. And one interesting statistic is that to create or to make each of these tunnels, they had to move earth which was worth 40 carriages. So 40 carriages worth of earth was moved to create each of these tunnels. So it's a really big engineering marvel. This is the engine and that's the train. It's just one wagon. So this is the train that the locals take, and this is what I took. I didn't take the tourist train, which is just a tourist thing. But here I got to see how the farmers use the train. They bring in their farm implements and they take groceries and they go about their daily life in this route. So that's one of the images on that train. So it's taken from within the train. So you go really, really close to the lake and you get a different perspective of this huge water body. One of the other interesting things about the Circum-Baikal Rail is that each of the villages along that rail track has a number. So it doesn't have a name, but it has a number: 102 kilometers, 98 kilometers, 68 kilometers. And these numbers are from Irkutsk, the distance from Irkutsk. So that's another interesting aspect of this train journey. And some of the villages would be just this, just one house. And the train would stop there for that one house. This is Khujir village on Olkhon Islet. And just to give you a perspective of the stretch of Siberian houses with their colorful rooftops. Unpaved roads, like really wide roads, but unpaved and largely no people, hardly any people. This is another perspective of the Shamanism rock from Olkhon Island. Another view. And this is from the northern tip of the lake. This is the frozen part of the lake, and I got to walk on the ice which was still frozen. This is an interesting story. This van, it is a military vehicle from the Soviet times, and it still is functional because it is the only sturdy vehicle with the kind of chassis and engine that it has, which can navigate those really difficult hill roads within the island. And this has created something of a cult, because people in the US or people who are interested in collecting vehicles, they kind of go for this. The model name, if anyone's interested, is UAZ450. This is one of the plane rides that I took from the southern tip of Lake Baikal to the northern tip, and it also somewhere it has elements of the Soviet times. It's one of the scariest plane rides that I took, and it feels like I was in the 70s or something. I want to talk a little bit about the food. So I got to experience a lot of course, the local food. And in the homestays within Siberia, of course, the hospitality was fabulous. They just often feed you too much. And there's a lot of baked stuff, croissants, all of that. This is a picture of the omul, the specialty fish that you get in Lake Baikal, and that is chak chak. So it's another sweet dish which you can just break off and eat. I was there during the FIFA World Cup. So in a lot of these fast food restaurants, I saw elements of the World Cup and the celebration of that place. So it was not hard to find vegetarian food, especially when I came to the West. And this is one aspect I really want to talk about, space food. As we know, Russia is quite nationalistic in fervor, and it's cool to actually show off your nationalism. So one of the food brands in Russia has introduced space food, where you get to eat food that the astronauts take up to space with them. And this picture was taken at the airport, at the Moscow airport, and you can just take it off you buy it off the vending machine, and it comes in tubes, and you just spread it on bread, or you just eat it as is. But for a typical Russian civilian, it's a way to connect with the nationalistic idea of being Russian, and their huge connection with their space life.
Excuse me, did you find out why they had the Korean calligraphy there?
No, I did not. I did not notice it.
Did you not? On top, under space food, that's Korean.
Oh,
Wow, that's so observant.
yes, I did not notice
Just
it.
wanted to the Korean.
I would have found out if I had seen that. I did not notice it. I will find out.
Chinese also the nationality, so that's it.
It's Chinese?
Yes, it is.
Looks Korean to me.
Okay, I will find out.
The same condition.
Okay, now very briefly about some people encounters. Like I said in the beginning, Russians are believed here or perceived here to be brusque and standoffish and not very warm people, compared to, say, if you traveled across India. But my experience was actually a mix of both. I found people to be absolutely, don't talk to me, don't look at me, and absolutely warm and welcoming and so giving and generous. This is one such woman I met on my very first day in Russia, and we became friends, and she even drove me to Lake Baikal. So my first visit of Lake Baikal was with her. These are people I met on the train. He is a handyman, a plumber, I think, and he really, really wanted to give me something. And so he gave me an old cell phone that he had, and that was his way of just showing appreciation for me being in his country. This is a very famous travel writer. His name is Anton Krotov, and I met him on the Baikal Railway, and he shared some very interesting insights all along that train journey, something I wouldn't have had if I hadn't met him. He in fact also showed me Roerik's house, which comes along that railway. And these are all people from Poland and Ukraine that I traveled with within the Kuji village in Olkhon Island. This is Igor Shalgin, and I met him in a small village called Teshet, and he has a banya attached to his outhouse, and so I had the authentic Russian steam bath experience. And he's very passionate about preserving the old way of doing the banya. And this is someone I trekked with. And this is in the church where you're supposed to wear, a headscarf and cover your legs when you enter. Yeah, and finally ending with some of the myths that we typically hear about Russia and how I did with them. Russians drink vodka all the time. I think they do. Everywhere I went, I did see them drinking a lot of vodka. They don't speak English at all. At least for me in the East, I found this to be very true. Because my comfort lay in people who spoke English, and that was so few and far between that for me, I truly understood the value of speaking a common language. Russians are rude, I would say 50-50, because I did meet an equal amount of both. Russian mafia rules the roads? No, I did not see that at all, and this has implications for safety. And one of the reasons why people don't travel to Russia is because they really feel
only in case Moscow is concerned, not in Siberia and other places.
Right. Yeah.
This Russian mafia is widespread only in Moscow and big cities.
Right. Yes. So I did not experience that. It's expensive and difficult to travel in Russia. I did not feel so at all because the Russian ruble is 120 against the Indian rupee. Russians are racist? No, I did not feel that at all. Russians are gloomy and cold? They can be. Also, I think because the weather is gloomy and cold most of the time. So they do come across as gloomy and cold. They're all communists? No, I did not feel that at all. Quite the contrary. And they are all spies? I would never know.
I have a question.
Yes.
Did you travel alone?
Yes, I did.
Who organized it for you because you don't know the language?
I organized it myself. I'm a little crazy.
No. We also do the same thing, so it's okay.
Yeah.
Then the Siberian Railway, it has only second and third classes? Or?
No, it has a first class.
Okay.
But the first class, when you do a DIY organizing, the first class is very difficult to get because most of them are blocked by the travel agents. And they're reserved and there are fewer seats in each train, so it's difficult to get a first. I tried really hard, but I couldn't get the Russia experience.
People carry their own food for such a long time, so they all carry those instant foods, is it?
Mostly instant foods, but then you do get off at stations and you buy food. They carry a lot of food in those thermos bags. They carry stacks of meat. All kinds of meat smells were unleashed on me, and I don't want to talk to you about that, but it's an experience.
They have English boards in most of
Nowhere.
But we saw here.
That
Street and all that was written.
Yeah, but that's only in the big cities. So that was only in Irkutsk, for example, in the east. Nowhere else did I see.
No.
Do they understand what you mean by vegetarianism?
No. They do not understand the concept at all.
They got the meat and
Did you do your train bookings online?
Should we keep the questions for later or should we keep going? Okay, I think we're going to take the questions at the end if that's okay. Because right now, so I've given you a very short glimpse of Siberia and the eastern part of Russia. Now I'd like to hand it over to Sadhana, who's going to now talk about the other side of Russia, the western part, Moscow and St Petersburg, which in contrast can also be extremely rich culturally and in the arts. So I'm going to invite Sadhana Rao to take us through Moscow and St Petersburg and its history.
Once again, Tale of Two Cities, Moscow and St Petersburg. I'm going to divide my talk into three quick segments. The first segment, I'll speak a little bit about the genesis of St Petersburg in relation to Moscow and the enduring cultural legacy. How the enduring cultural legacies, in part two, keep the cultural moorings of both the cities extremely centered, and how the legacies, the centeredness, all gets preserved in part three. Of history and living in Moscow. 3 centuries of the same in St. Petersburg. both cities have endured, both urban habitats have endured their legacies in their journeys as cities. Both cities sometimes very wisely and sometimes not so wisely have understood that history doesn't always present very pleasant circumstances. Both cities have undergone wars, sieges, plunder, bloody change of regimes, revolutions, and yet have survived. So my traveling writer's lenses was captivated by their defiance against all the odds, their amazing cultural plurality, the plinth of their cultural plurality, and their ability to just simply exist. From the time of its inception, any travel writer or any researcher in Russia is always told that these cities are warring with each other. Well, they share the same DNA, they are like siblings, but their personalities are entirely different. However, as a writer, there are those quiet moments in explosive history where the citizens and the citizenry have been at intersections and crossroads of action and existence and have actually acted in the same way with the fiercely Russian pride. A point in illustration being when, in 1812, when France and Napoleon's troops invaded Moscow, Moscow, rather than being occupied by France, goes on to burn itself. And if you see, this is the entrance to the Red Square and Kremlin. This was all rebuilt. And the Hermitage, this is the Hermitage, the most important iconic building of St. Petersburg. In the Second World War, St. Petersburg faces the worst siege in military history. And yet their reactions and the way they held on to the Leningrad siege, so miles apart, I'm not too sure about that. So if I were to look at the map, if I were to draw your attention to the map of Russia, and sometimes it's the way the geography has defined the identity of the two cities. So you have St. Petersburg here, and you have Moscow here. So the geographical location has given St. Petersburg an identity of the mind, of being the window to Europe, and Russia and Moscow becomes the heart and the traditional bastion. Peter the Great is the Tsar who wanted to develop his naval strength and wanted to look towards the Gulf of Finland, towards Sweden, so he ordered himself a new capital. And he shifted the capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg. He ordered a new capital for himself. He was tired of the age-old Byzantine influence in Russia, of Russia in Moscow, so he just went about and wanted to order a new capital. UK London style embankment and admiralty, Italian frescoes, facades, neoclassical French style boulevards, and so he shifts the capital to St. Petersburg. Any guesses what this would be? Oh, of course, I've written it there, so. Yeah. So this is one of the most important churches in Moscow. It's the mother of all Orthodox Church, namely because it's within, actually, can you think of our Rashtrapati Bhavan having a temple square? So this is very well within the Kremlin red walls. There's a white square called the Church Square, and this is the Domitian Cathedral, I think built by an Italian architect, Aristotle Firiovani. This cathedral is emblematic of everything Russia. If you see the domes, if you see the domes, does it ring a bell to anybody? Where else would these domes be? Taj Mahal in India. Right?
Istanbul as well.
No, the domes are very different.
No, so Istanbul as well. It's those minutes. So it's the Onion Dome, which is the Islamic invasion. But in Russia, the dome is tapered to shape a candle in reverence. So this is the most traditional sign of a Moscow church.
We said known as a Russian Orthodox Church.
Yes, sir.
Russian
It is the
Orthodox.
Russian Orthodox. So if you'd like me to elaborate for a minute, yes, Russia took the Orthodox, and of course when the communist regime came, atheism was the government diktat. This is a church. So this is what Peter the Great does when he shifts the capital to St. Petersburg, completely striking different notes. The church has undergone a tremendous change. You have completely Western influence. I'm sorry? You have a completely Western influences of the tall spire and Dutch influence, and completely different. This historical journey sort of seals the fate of the two cities belonging to the same motherland, but actually the chord of difference is striking. Both Moscow and St. Petersburg are grand cities, ornamental, luxurious, and whatever the regime may have been, whether it's the Tsars, whether it's the Communist Party controlling or the free market economy as we have today, construction, elaborate techniques are always a sign of the cities. But I'd like to draw your attention to a small fact. It's almost as if the rulers are in a very comfortable schizophrenia. They are on their mission to acquire their wealth, they're on their mission to acquire their art, and completely impervious to the craftsmen. Now, for a considerable length of time, Russia had serfs. And so, it is the craftsmanship of the unseen craft to which Moscow and St. Petersburg today owes its debt. To just highlight a craft called the mosaic. This is the Church of the Savior of the Spilled Blood in St. Petersburg. It has about 7,600 square meters of mosaic inlay work done by hand. The same mosaic work, but a little finer, is done in the 1930s in a metro station in Moscow. But if you see, the imagery has changed because now the women worker has joined the workforce. This is an image of the Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg. As I mentioned, it is the bulk of St. Petersburg in Moscow was built by a large workforce, and the craftsmen spending so many hours and years in sheer industrious work move on to becoming almost artisans. So while St. Petersburg has been severely criticized as the playground of the rich, there is a narrative which says it was also the birthplace of fresh ideas. So you have the artist called Andrea Veronsky, who was a serf, born serf to the Stroganov family. By the sheer grit of his art, he buys himself the freedom, goes on to train from being an artisan to an architect, and builds the Kazan Cathedral, which is again a departure from the past. This is an image which which he's impressed with is the St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. There is a protest against having a Roman Catholic imagery of a church in St. Petersburg, which is the capital, that is overruled, and you have a serf artisan turned architect to build Kazan. And Kazan today is the most, when religion came back to Russia in 2000, this is the most popular worshipping cathedral in St. Petersburg. So given the enduring legacies of St. Petersburg and Moscow, they are both cities, despite all the odds of war, they are very rooted in their culture. They're very authentic, unapologetic about their cultural moorings. They have no debate, they don't want to posture other than what they are. Art and culture cannot be bargained for. Either it's overground or it's underground, whatever the regime may be. The Russian art and crafts have found their ways to survive. So if I were to, this is an aerial view of the building, the Hermitage. For that first intense, immersive experience of art, Moscovites will canvas for their museum, the Tretyakov, which is the Russian Museum of Art, a beautiful, wonderful collection. My vote went for the Hermitage, second only to the Louvre. It has about 3 million pieces in there. Not all are on display. The museum director would say that you need 8 years sabbatical to complete the entire collection. It just goes to show how assiduously the Tsars and the rulers collected Western art. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to take you on a quick, curated slide tour of the Hermitage. Just to give you a glimpse of what all is there. French art, German art, English art. Of the 14 Leonardo da Vinci's in the world, 2 of the original are at the Hermitage. Renoir, Rodin, Monet, Van Gogh, Cezanne. I'm going to end the art trail with this image, which is an absolute study of contrast. This is not the art attack that I took you on earlier. Would anybody here in the room know what this image is about? Okay, I'll come back to that. So that was what Moscow and St. Petersburg have done with their art, where it's free-flowing, without restrictions, without borders, without diktats. Prior to this, art was also not an art attack, but it was an art diktat. That is a beautiful 11th century iconostasis from a church which just commands veneration, where art is still not in the participation mode. This is a very popular form of Russian poster art, which I think is the image which the Western propaganda media picked up as there was no information coming out of Russia. And this is what actually it means, very close to two Hindi words, na bolte, which means stop your chatter. Of music and music scores. Herein lies a biggest irony between St. Petersburg and Moscow. While in the art architecture, St. Petersburg marries modernity, marries Western influences. The reverse happens in music and musical scores. While artistic endeavors always tell mankind that the world is not to be quartered and possessed, but to be illumined and expanded your horizons. Now that's pretty much what Russian music did. Russia has a very rich tradition of folk music. Their instruments like the balalika, the guzli, the dombra, and the imported instrument from Germany, the accordion. Even today, people remember Raj Kapoor, even the younger generations. Raj Kapoor's films are there on their television networks with Mera Juta Hai Japani. So Russia had a very rich tradition of folk music, which is what integrated Siberia to the length and breadth and the 11 time zones across regimes. It is in the absorption of Western classical music and dance where the fight began, where a ceaseless controversy was raised between St. Petersburg and Moscow. These composers, these are the 5 famous Russian composers who belong to St. Petersburg. They are referred to as the Mighty Five in appreciation. With critical overtones, they are referred to as the Mighty Heap. But to a musicologist's mind, they fought a very important battle and they rejected the absorption of West. No matter how alluring, how enticing it was, they rejected the concept of Western classical music in its form by calling it foreign. They wanted to integrate it with Russian nationalistic pride. So the St. Petersburg Conservatory went traditional. The Moscow Conservatory, headed by Tchaikovsky, shed their traditional garbs and actually respected it for its sheer appeal. Though a rapprochement happened, and you have a rare picture of Tchaikovsky with the Mighty Five, to my mind, this battle, this distillation was extremely important because what the world got was Nutcracker, Swan Lake, Spring Dance. These were compositions which integrated the Russian folk songs, the absolutely upper chest, the Ukrainian and the Russian style of singing has a very conversational intonation in the opera. So the contribution that the Russian composers with their battle made to the Western classical world was of absolute immeasurable value. This kind of fight didn't really happen in ballet. When ballet came in from France and it merged with the Russian folk dance and the harvest bodily movement techniques, it almost became as if it was an indigenous native form. The only fight was between who would get what, between the Imperial School of Ballet in St. Petersburg and the Bolshoi Theatre in Moscow. So these are the two important theatres, the Bolshoi, which came up in 1830, and the Mariinsky Theatre in St. Petersburg, which came up in 1860. They have been platforms that have brought in a wide spectrum and have really allowed the arts to flourish. While they are old buildings, they have absolutely gen-next acoustic. An experience here just defies the verbal news of words. It is, and it stays in the medium of the experience. Today, the Tchaikovsky Conservatory, based in Moscow, has actually managed to knit both the cities. They run a worldwide competition today where people from all over the world apply. One part of the competition is held in St. Petersburg, one part of the competition is held in Moscow, but it is mandatory to play one composition from the original of the Russian composers. When you walk through Mariinsky and when you walk through the Bolshoi, you just wonder, what if Hitler had spent more hours listening to Wagner? And what if Joseph Stalin, who was actually a poet and a singer from Georgia, had spent more time in music? Maybe the world would have been a far better place. Okay, I'll keep track of time. Of verse and prose. For the longest period of time, Russia and Russian voices were like sealed off. They were not available to the world. So if there's one word I would use to describe the mighty Russian writers, it's brave. They went to places where nobody else went. For the purpose of St. Petersburg and Moscow, I'm going to pick up on Leo Tolstoy in his Anna Karenina. He actually builds the character of the cities into his characters. So you have Anna Karenina, who moves from Moscow to St. Petersburg, and she is referred to as the sophisticated socialite from St. Petersburg, whereas her country cousins are considered provincial. Immediately, he corroborates that with a character called Vronsky, who compares Moscow to, who works in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and goes for a home visit to Moscow, and he compares Moscow to a warm bed, as opposed to the coarse life that he leads in St. Petersburg. Anna Akhmatov, I would like to take a reference to a woman poet who lived in St. Petersburg, and she revered the birthplace of free ideas, but in her last years and in her exile, she comes out with a poem called A Poem Without Heroes, in which she criticizes what happens to St. Petersburg under Stalin. So, as I mentioned earlier in my talk, that Russia, as a country, war is a part of its culture. Its scene was in the Second World War. It was a country which suffered the maximum human losses. So, the idea that the circumference of damage in war, the circumference of damage is far greater than the circle of target, is what is stayed in the Russian psyche, be it in the rulers, be it. So they have a very strong sense of preservation. I'll quickly run through the preservation. So this is the Cathedral of the Savior, of Christ the Savior. This is the place where in Tchaikovsky's overture was first screened. This was destroyed in 1930 on the orders of Joseph Stalin. And it is in 2000, when the religion has come back to Russia, 1,000 Muscovites raised money and have rebuilt the church. So what took 40 years to build, took a couple of months to demolish, has been rebuilt in 4 years as per the old plan. This is the Glinka Museum of Culture in Moscow. This is the Shermadev Palace in St. Petersburg. It has a collection of musical instruments from the entire region as well as from Europe. During the Second World War, the museum staff actually took the musical instruments and hid them under their beds to be returned back to the museum, as was done with the Hermitage paintings in the Hermitage. They were all shipped and evacuated as the convoys were leaving to the Ural Mountains, and today they live to tell its tale. This is just to show the preservation. So what is it about the pathology of a centralist regime? We wouldn't have Rome if it wasn't for Mussolini, who actually preserved it. So while Joseph Stalin gave you the Gulag, he also gave a curriculum design of education which today is revered as its best. I tried to lay my hands on that document. It's state property. Today, even the younger generation talk about that education plan as being something great. So this is where the preservation instinct has gone bordering now on paranoia. This is something called the Bunker 42. It's based in Moscow. It was conceived by Joseph Stalin. It's minus 16. It's 65 feet underground. It's what is called, he built a township in preparedness for a Holocaust. Well, the Holocaust never happened. Both Moscow and St. Petersburg have given a toss to time and mortality, and they still live to tell their tale. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here.
I have two questions. I got an occasion to travel by road in eastern part of Russia. You mentioned a lot about the Siberian Railway and people who are traveling and all the facilities available and all. What about the road network?
The road network is actually equally impressive.
People say it's very poor in
No, the highway is actually very good. In fact, I had the opportunity to drive along a stretch of the highway near Taishet. So the road network is very good as long as it's the highway. In the inside also it's not too bad. No potholes like in India, but it's not as great as US or the West.
Moscow and St. Petersburg have Bangalore-like traffic jams.
Almost like that.
That's worse. Moscow is worse than Bangalore. Bangalore we move at least. In Moscow you don't.
How did you manage your cash? Travelers say this cards accepted there?
No, I took cash. I hid them in places I won't tell you where I hid them. But the reason is that I was spending so much time in Siberia, where ATMs are few and far between. I was advised to carry cash. So I did carry cash from Bangalore.
If I may to add to that, even in Moscow and St. Petersburg, the cityscape is dotted with museums, house museums, as I mentioned in the preservation, dotted with house museums of writers, musicians, composers. Most places, while they have the credit card machine, I'm talking about both the capitals, smaller museums, you had to give cash and rubles. So yeah, it's better to carry cash in Russia.
So you carry rubles from India?
Yes, I did. But you could buy, I could have also taken US dollars and exchanged them there, which is also one way people do it. I just prefer to take the rubles from here.
In which month did you travel?
I went in the month of May and June. So mid-May to mid-June. It was still snowing through most of Siberia. Erratically though, not every day, but it was still cold. It was hovering around zero. And as I moved westward, it got warmer, because by then it was also into June and mid-June. Moscow and St. Petersburg were quite pleasant. I wouldn't say warm yet, but it was around 22.
I traveled to catch the white nights. Moscow, St. Petersburg has a very gloomy, very bad weather for most parts of the year. There is that little window of time where you don't see the sun. It's what all the writers have spoken about. So I traveled to catch the white nights.
When is that?
That is from the period of 15th of July, give or take a few days, to somewhere 10th of June to the 8th of July. I'm sorry, I meant June. Yeah, it's beautiful.
During winter, those villagers along the lake, Michael, do they move to warmer places or they are there?
They don't. Most of them stay put, and they do, and they are cut off quite a bit, but they do manage. I don't know if you've heard of this concept called dacha, where from the rural areas they move in the summer months to their farms and they grow their food and they try to preserve that for their heavy, harsh winter months. So that happens a lot in the summer, but they're quite well stocked usually through the winter months.
Yeah, I've seen a row of
There's a
houses,
question
village
back,
houses in a Siberian part of the country. How do they manage to keep the house warm during the extreme winter? Because I see just like Indian houses, So just have a sloped roof, maybe with like a mangrove tile, something like that. But
So
extreme
technology
winter,
is,
whether how do they
pretty-
keep the houses warm?
Yeah, technology is pretty good,
Pretty
even
heater.
in the
Pretty heater.
even in the villages. So they do have heaters. You cannot survive without heaters. But I did go to some very remote fishing villages in the northern tip of around Lake Baikal. There they did not have heaters, and it was so remote that their toilets were built outside, and it was those open toilets. And I was asking the host, how do they manage it? They said, this is our life, this is how we live.
So do they have
There's a
bukai?
question back. That lady, yeah.
Sadhana, all this truly magnificent music and poetry and literature, is it being consciously taught in school curricula, and the young people now with so much influence from the West, how are they holding on to all this? Is it through education, through public awareness? What do they do?
So as I mentioned, there's I think both even Sumaa mentioned about the Russian pride. So there's a feisty Russian pride. And as I said, Russia had a very, very rich musical culture. So if you were to go to the Sharmatev Museum and the Glinka Museum, it's astounding to see the range of musical instruments that they have. A. B. Even in the communist, so you had Peter the Great when St Petersburg was set up, you had the Western influences coming. Most of the composers have gone. And when Western classical music came into Russia, you have to understand parallelly what's happened. By the 1600s, the major and the minor keys have been in place. So tonality has allowed for people to loop in. So what happens is there is almost 300 years of arts culture happening, coupled with the curriculum design of the Soviet Union, which was legendary. Today what has happened is, while there is a centralist regime, my lenses showed that they've taken to the free, I didn't have time to run you through 4 slides, they have taken to the free market economy in a centralist regime. There are enough underground garage areas where there is cutting edge New York-like music happening. The Hermitage, for instance, out of the 4 million tourists it receives, 2 million are domestic tourists. So they are holding on. I can't say for Siberia, but in Moscow and St. Petersburg, where I've spent extensive time and done a lot of research, there is a curriculum where arts and culture is not extracurricular, it is co-scholastic. The stakeholders, whether it is the gentry, whether it is the education board, they all have looped in to make it co-scholastic. So as we speak, Gergiev is almost considered on par with opera at London, and I got to see Verdi's Requiem, which is of world class. I hope we've answered your question. Yes, sir. Somebody here wanted to.
Will you tell us something about the Russian films and Russian theatres?
Yeah, we didn't have a time to take that on, but of course with Dr. Zivago and winning. No, I know, but we would love to take that on offline. That was a segment which we decided because that compares into Siberia and for the pressures of time. But it's a very thriving scene.
If I may ask a second question.
Sure.
Has there been any impact, particularly in the Siberian region, about the global warming?
Yes, but the awareness about that locally at the grassroots level is still limited. But the impact, yes, is there. So it's actually getting colder. It's not, but there is a climate change for sure.
I won't say only because the time that I was in Moscow, the temperatures predicted was 28, and it's summer. and within 2 days it dropped to 9. Rain, 9, wind chill factor.
Do they use
That's quite
Bukhari?
typical.
You know what a Bukhari is, you know?
You may have
We use
seen the
them in,
Bukhari. That's that heat, you know it.
Oh, yes, yes.
We use them in the, you know, near the Siachen Glacier, toys,
Yeah.
where you put that. Do they use that kind of stuff?
Yes, I did see that in a couple of homestays, but they've all turned electric now. So they don't use those. I mean, they're there as a relic, but they've all gone electric. Every room has a heater. Technology is like pretty far and wide.
The other thing I wanted to ask was, what's the take on Svetlana there in Russia?
Well, she left the country. So the metros came up in the time of Joseph Stalin. But if you were, and I would recommend a metro, I didn't have time to run through the slides, but actually the metro movement is it's from the palaces, it's moved to the metro stations. So a metro tour is highly recommended in terms of art. So there is a place, forget Svetlana, there's a place which had Joseph Stalin's statue, which has been originally removed, and Lenin's statue has been placed. So there are these, Anna Akhmatova and all are very, very critical. But in all fairness to her work, I cannot comment because she left the country.
Can I highlight a little bit on Svetlana?
Sure.
You have a mic or something? Yeah.
Would you like to come up here?
No, it's okay. I'm weak about that. You know, my wife's mother was Rani Usha Kumari, Dinesh Singh's sister, real sister. So when Svetlana left Russia, as you know, her third husband was Brajesh Singh, that is Dinesh Singh's uncle. He was a very fine guy, but he was a commie. Right. And my wife tells me a lot of stories about it. Now, she came to the family place, which is a place called Kalakankal, on the banks of the Ganges. And she opened a hospital out there, which is still there. It's run by somebody. And then she loved that, Indianness which she had picked up. And she gave my late mother-in-law about 6 of these ordinary Russian, wine glasses. Just ordinary. We got about 4 left. And then when she went to Delhi, they said Dinesh Singh didn't really help, but MC Chawla was the main guy. And then what happened, then she took some American help, and she fled from there and went to Switzerland and then married this other guy in the US. So that was in the essence of the story. She never agreed with her dad's philosophy, but she really was in love with Brajesh Singh, who was an extremely fine human being.
Thank you for sharing that story.
If I could just tag on, just rewind a bit to the point you made about art in the metro stations. And I'd like to, connect that with the question you had about English, whether the street signs are in English language or not. One of my friends in Bombay helped me plan this trip across Russia, and one of the things that she told me was to please carry a printout of the Moscow metro map and the St Petersburg metro map. Keep one day completely to look at the most important metro stations, because it is truly a museum tour. There's so much art in each of those metro stations, and they've done such a good job of preserving it.
It's called People's Palace,
Yeah,
the metro stations.
And the English, even in the West, like in Kazan also, I was traveling in the metro. I did not see English signboards there. In Moscow, only the big stations have English signboards. So I had to carry the PDF of an English language metro map, print out in color from here, marking out the stations with the most beautiful art in them, and had to plan it according to that. So
if I could just add to that, there is a metro station in Moscow called Kievskaya, which is where on the railway station, the trains from from Ukraine coming. So actually the artwork is all Ukrainian there. Despite whatever the art has not been removed.
So, can you just give us a rough idea about the costing? Let's say if you went by the Siberian train, and Moscow and St Petersburg and maybe Kiev and a Lake Baikal. How much really would it cost and how many days would it involve?
Yeah. So the train journeys itself, each train journey would translate to 2 Indian rupees would be around 5,000 to 7,000 if you did the third class or the second class. The first class would be about starting upwards of 10,000 onwards. And of course, it's not a hop on, hop off, as most people think it is, just because it's called the Trans-Siberian. You book your ticket from point to point. And Lake Baikal is so accessible. That's one of the myths we carry about Russia, that it's difficult and it's expensive. It's not. And there are not many hotel rooms around Lake Baikal. You have to go to a homestay. And they're very, very comfortable homestays for 1,000 rubles a night. And pretty much you don't have any other options, so you take that. And they're very comfortable. And so that would be about 1,200 to 1,500 rupees a night, and that includes food. So it's actually very accessible. So
My host, if I may add, my host just made me join in the service from St Petersburg to Moscow. This was a ticket cost of 9,000, is what I found out, but it came with, just for the experience of the service. We were served a 4-course meal, and just to see the Trans-Siberian experience.
that would be the Russia.
Yeah, that's right.
First class.
First class.
No, it wasn't first class. It was one level below the
Even
first
that
class.
they have.
Yeah, they have
different types of
between the
trains.
first class itself, there are about, so we were at the lowest end.
And there are different trains.
How-
so they're
how
the
good
most.
is their
Yes,
standard
sir.
of
There's a
living?
sorry.
Sumaa, how good is their standard of living? Is it very comfortable?
Yes.
Just like Western Europe, or it is
Better.
It's not. Yeah, it is.
No?
I would say as good as
Oh,
Western.
as good as
Yes.
So I must say something.
Their per capita income is a little lower than Western Europe. Because the economy is not doing that much good. And maybe the rich, just like in India, rich people are richer, poor people are suffering. That disparities are
Yes,
there.
that gap is there.
I would wonder if Sumaa would agree with me that it's a very clean country.
Yeah, they are good.
It's
They don't do anything.
extremely clean. After a long time, I saw trucks of water. In olden days in Calcutta, you would have the water trucks coming and watering the. I saw that, and they have that in all sizes. For a pavement, there's a separate water carrier. There's a lot of Russian pride in cleanliness. I think it's cleaner than you.
It is.
Speaking about the water, this mouth
I'm sorry,
watering
was
to-
there a question? Yeah, sorry, yes.
Being alone and a lady traveling, did you have any law and order issue ever?
I wasn't alone. I think Sumaa will take that. She's the solo traveler.
Yes, the apprehension was there, and that's a very good question, because at the time that I decided to do this trip, the Me Too movement in India was gaining ground. So when you have this collective consciousness talking about safety and the fact that public places are not really for women, and you're really not safe anywhere, the question did come up to my mind multiple times. But this is not the first solo trip that I've done. I've traveled 18 countries solo over the last 13 years. So I feel that traveling in Russia with those apprehensions came also with a bit of the experience that I had carried from all my years of solo travel, and a bit of craziness, because you have to have that bit of courage mixed with a bit of craziness to say, okay, I'm going to cross this threshold of fear and see what's on the other side. Having said that, within Russia itself, I did not at any point feel threatened. I did not feel fear. or I did not feel intimidated. People are brusque, maybe. They just don't want to talk to you, that's fine. But I did not at any time feel threatened as a solo Indian woman who didn't know the language traveling in that very foreign culture.
In my extensive stay, I had only one bad experience, and that was our fault. We are advised not to take a cab off the road. So if you're a taxi.
Okay.
Again, so if you're, and you can't go through the Uber network, they have the Yandex, they have their local service. So that's the only bad experience where if it is say 300 rubles a distance, he can overcharge to 2000. Otherwise, you are advised to go to any nearest hotel if you're in that particular if you're doing a museum or something, you can go to a nearest hotel and have the concierge call a taxi. I've had only one bad experience.
How do they feel about Indian people? Are they very warm towards Indian people or very cold?
They
Or they are
are.
not aware of us?
No, in fact, they are really, the people who were friendly and wanted to open up and start conversations are overly friendly. They wanted to take lots of selfies. In fact, in the West especially, I had lots of people coming up to me and asking if they could take a photograph with me. And they didn't know the language, but they were happy to, even with the little translator app that we had, communicate a little bit. They are very, very warm, actually, if they do open up.
So I have just the statistic of the Hermitage Museum director who said that he doesn't see too many Indian tourists. And I think I wouldn't say I had extraordinary experiences, but yeah, they're very friendly, and say in the entire 1.5 months, I would say that 2-3 people came up to me about Raj Kapoor. That's about it.
How large is the space of the paintings in the Hermitage, and how long would it actually take to do it properly? Just the paintings?
Just the paintings, it's an 8-year sabbatical if you want to do the entire thing. So, since I spent a considerable part of my time, the trick is almost like Sudoku. You have to get the best guide, right? You do get an art attack. So it's like the Louvre. So the selection criteria of the guide becomes important. I was guided. I downloaded the book. I read the book. I marked what I wanted to see, and accordingly, a guide was arranged for us who was specific in European art, in Dutch art. So it's important to do a bit of planning before you go to the Hermitage. I didn't find, like the Louvre, where the Louvre has a 15-day pass. I didn't find it was a single entry, at least because it was the time of the White Nights and the lines were humongous. So I had to buy a ticket every day. So the guide selection becomes critical in any large museum.
Russia was part of Soviet Union till everything is split. But the neighboring countries, do they have any bitterness against each other the way we have with Pakistan or even Bangladesh? You require visa and there is not so much friendliness and travel, etc. Did you see that for the other neighboring countries which were part of Soviet Union?
So, it's a fantastic question. I was warned about it, but I was having dinner at a Georgian restaurant and there is animosity, but it looked as if the world was one big party. Georgian food is, being a vegetarian, as I was explaining to Sumaa, for me it was Georgian food always, because that's where I got. It's at the surface level, it's very safe. It's a centralist state. So we didn't, as in my sphere of the arts, I didn't feel it. I don't know if Sumaa would like to add to that.
Yeah, just an anecdote from one of the day trips that I did within Kujir village. So we were a motley bunch of people from very different nationalities, and there were quite a few Eastern Europeans in that group. and there were a couple of Polish people, and I could see that they were very, very interested in looking at the main historical spots around Lake Baikal, which have huge Polish significance. So the group was accommodative of their need to visit those spots and to revisit a part of Poland left over in Russia. So that was something that I experienced firsthand, and there was no friction there. It was a very...
Why is there a Polish connection with Baikal?
There were a few people who lived around the Lake Baikal, and we went to a cemetery on the way to Cape Cowboy along the lake. And that cemetery had, some of the ancestors of these people, and they also had a military connection with Poland. So there were lots of historical connections.
I think we have time for one last question. Is somebody at the back who raised their hand? Yes.
I have one question. In terms of culture and all that, I was expecting description of the Russian tradition in circus and gypsies. I think the gypsy dance and circus, I think they're very inherent to the Russian culture, I thought. Any comments?
My trip was centered around St Petersburg and Moscow this time, and I didn't have time to see a Russian circus, so I'm sorry I cannot comment on it. Would Sumaa like to take it?
I did not either.
Sorry for the omission.
Must be daily not.
No, it's, yeah.
Just like India. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, yes. One last question, Madhumita? Yeah.
I don't know when was your travel, but any comments on how is I've heard a lot about this, but any comments on how the LGBTQ acceptability is? Do you, any awareness?
Very, very good question. And it's not really open. I would actually draw the analogy with China, because I feel in India there's still a lot more awareness, and with the Pride walks and everything, we are increasing awareness about the LGBTQ community. But in Russia, it's still very nascent, and the awareness, of course, is coming only in Moscow and St Petersburg, and they go through a lot of trouble to do the Pride marches there even. And people don't talk about it openly. It is still very, very conservative in that way.
I would agree with Sumaa, and the only addition I could make to that is that in the underground artistic world, I have come across two extremely talented singers in a very Russian rap form. I do not know that art, so I just found the timbre and the tone of their voices excellent, and that's the only place where I saw them speak openly. But other than that, I would tend to agree with Sumaa. Right. With that, we conclude Russia Up Close and Personal. Thank you so much.